good news about NVIDIA. They're finally focusing on Linux with contributing to an open source.
Microsoft has been doing their damnedest to absolutely ruin Windows 11. You've seen it. I've seen it. We all know that it's real. It's feature creep. It's, surveillance malware baked right into the operating system.
Rid of Windows forever, install Linux, and never look.
Here is the number that changes everything. 73%. That is NVIDIA's share of the Steam hardware survey. 3 out of every 4 PC gamers running NVIDIA graphics cards in their machines. The most dominant position any hardware company holds in consumer gaming. The company whose GPU sits inside the majority of gaming rigs worldwide just posted senior engineering roles specifically targeting Linux gaming performance, offering $200,000 annual salaries to engineers whose explicit job description is diagnosing performance bottlenecks in Vulkan and Proton. Titles and implementing driver-level changes to fix them. Not experimenting with Linux compatibility as a side project. Not adding Linux as an afterthought to serve a niche audience. Hiring top-tier engineers at top-tier compensation to build Linux gaming infrastructure from the ground up, including native speed gaming on ARM-based Linux platforms, for the hardware generation that is coming next. You do not pay $200,000 a year to chase a side project. You pay $200,000 a year when you are repositioning a company for a market transition you believe is coming, regardless of what your current platform partner does about it. NVIDIA controls 73% of the gaming GPU market. NVIDIA just told you where it believes gaming is going. And the destination is not Windows. This is not a story about Linux getting slightly better. This is not a story about a few tech enthusiasts switching operating systems as a hobby project. This is the story of the most powerful GPU company on Earth making a calculated decision that the Windows gaming monopoly is no longer permanent, and investing engineering resources and serious money into building the infrastructure for what comes after it. Microsoft has been making Windows worse for years, while telling users they had nowhere else to go. NVIDIA just proved them wrong. And with 73% of Steam's hardware survey behind them, when NVIDIA decides Linux gaming matters, it matters for almost every serious gamer on the planet. Start with what NVIDIA actually built and what they are building, because the specifics reveal a strategic commitment that goes far beyond anything that could be dismissed as hedging or experimentation.
To see NVIDIA actually contributing to it and making it better. Maybe it opens a future where most people can just use Nova and NVK on Linux, and people who really need professional support or commercial support or a supported official driver can use the NVIDIA one.
The Nova driver is NVIDIA's open-source GPU driver for Turing architecture GPUs and newer, actively developed, publicly available, receiving regular contributions. The NVK Vulkan driver is being built out specifically to optimize Vulkan gaming performance on Linux. GeForce Now, NVIDIA's cloud gaming service, now has native Linux support, meaning NVIDIA is serving Linux users directly through their highest-profile cloud gaming product. And then there is the engineering hiring, which is where the strategic intent becomes impossible to misread. A senior system software engineer role for Vulkan performance with the explicit mandate of diagnosing GPU and CPU performance bottlenecks in Vulkan and Proton titles and implementing driver changes targeting performance, power efficiency, and latency. A Linux graphics senior software engineer focused on building high-performance dynamic binary translation solutions to enable native speed x86-64 gaming on Linux ARM64 platforms. That second role is the one that demands the most attention because it points directly at what NVIDIA is building toward. ARM-based Linux gaming platforms. NVIDIA is co-developing the N1 and N1X chips with MediaTek, ARM-based processors that pair ARM CPU cores with GeForce RTX graphics specifically for portable gaming devices. NVIDIA is building handheld gaming hardware. That hardware runs on Linux. The engineers being hired at $200,000 per year are not improving drivers for desktop Linux users as a goodwill gesture to an existing community. They are building the performance foundation for NVIDIA-powered gaming handhelds that will compete directly with the Steam Deck and the expanding ecosystem of Linux-based portable gaming devices. The person who wins the handheld gaming market in 2026 and beyond does not need Windows. NVIDIA has looked at that market, looked at where it is going, and is hiring accordingly. Every single engineering investment, the Nova driver, the NVK Vulkan work, the GeForce Now Linux support, the ARM Linux performance engineering, points at a company building a complete Linux gaming ecosystem as insurance against a future where Windows gaming dominance is not guaranteed. That is strategic hedging at the highest organizational level. And strategic hedging of that magnitude reveals institutional belief about what is coming. The Steam hardware survey data for March 2026 is the statistical backdrop against which NVIDIA's moves need to be understood. Linux gaming crossed 33% market share, the highest Linux has ever reached on Steam, representing a more than doubling from where it stood just over a year earlier. Windows dropped below 93% market share among Steam users for the first time in the platform's history. Windows 10 usage collapsed by nearly 15% in March 2026 alone. And the critical detail that the headline numbers do not capture on their own, a significant portion of those departing Windows 10 users did not upgrade to Windows 11. They went to Linux. They looked at what Microsoft was offering them as an upgrade path and chose to switch operating systems entirely rather than accept it. That is not a statistic measuring passive platform decay. That is a measurement of active rejection. Users making deliberate decisions to change something that most people never consciously chose in the first place, because what they were being offered in its place was worse than the cost of changing. The 33% figure gets used by commentators to dismiss Linux gaming as marginal. The framing misrepresents what the number measures. Windows comes pre-installed on virtually every gaming PC sold. No decision is required to be a Windows gamer. You buy the machine, and Windows is on it. Switching to Linux requires downloading an installation image, creating bootable media, making a deliberate choice to replace the default, and accepting the uncertainty of learning a different system. Every single person in that 5.33% made that deliberate choice voluntarily. That is not passive adoption driven by default behavior. That is intentional adoption driven by genuine preference. And intentional adoption scales through word of mouth, through community advocacy, through honest experience reports shared between people who trust each other's accounts, mechanisms that default adoption does not generate. The 5.33% who chose Linux actively tell people. The 93% running Windows by default mostly do not. The momentum in that number is being generated by the smaller group. Proton has done something that no Linux advocate could have accomplished through years of making the technical and philosophical case for open source computing. It made the game library argument for Windows obsolete. Proton now enables roughly 90% of Windows games to run on Linux. Over 21,000 titles are certified as fully playable on SteamOS. More than 15,000 additional titles work through Proton with strong community-verified reports. The single biggest structural argument for staying on Windows as a gamer, your library only runs on Windows, has been effectively neutralized. The excuse that kept millions of frustrated users on Windows despite everything Microsoft was doing to them has been removed by Valve's engineering investment in Linux gaming infrastructure. And Valve has now revealed Steam Machine verified requirements at GDC 2026, signaling that SteamOS is being prepared to expand beyond the Steam Deck to desktop PCs, third-party handhelds, and whatever comes after. The ecosystem is no longer Valve alone. Lenovo's Legion Go already officially supports SteamOS. Other hardware manufacturers are following. What started as a single product category is becoming an industry standard with multiple manufacturers contributing hardware to the same Linux-based gaming ecosystem. When NVIDIA's engineering resources are added to this picture, resources specifically directed at improving the Proton experience, the Vulkan performance, and the ARM-based Linux gaming infrastructure that underpins the handheld category, the trajectory of Linux gaming becomes something that market share numbers from a year ago cannot adequately capture. NVIDIA's 73% Steam hardware survey position means that the engineering work they are doing on Linux driver optimization benefits the majority of Steam users who make the switch. The performance improvements flowing from NVIDIA's Linux engineering investment will be available to every NVIDIA GPU owner running Linux. That is not a niche improvement for a specialized audience. That is performance infrastructure being built for most of the gaming market by the company whose hardware most of the gaming market runs. NVIDIA's driver history with Linux is the context that makes their current investment so significant. For years, NVIDIA's Linux driver support was genuinely poor, the legitimate technical barrier that kept Linux gaming from being viable for the majority of users running NVIDIA hardware. Performance was inconsistent. Advanced features were missing or partially implemented. Professional Linux users avoided NVIDIA hardware specifically because the driver support was inadequate. The community maintained workarounds and compatibility layers, but the underlying driver quality created a ceiling on what Linux gaming could achieve on the hardware that most gamers used. AMD never had this problem. AMD's open-source AMD-GPU driver has been built into the Linux kernel for years. Vulkan performance on AMD hardware running Linux is exceptional, frequently within 1 to 3% of equivalent Windows performance on the same hardware, with frame pacing often better on Linux than Windows. The Steam Deck runs AMD hardware, which is part of why Valve chose it. The driver situation was solved. But the Steam hardware survey shows 73% of users running NVIDIA. The Linux gaming story could not fully scale to the majority of gaming hardware, while NVIDIA's driver situation remained inadequate. NVIDIA's open-source kernel driver rollout changed the architectural relationship between their hardware and the Linux kernel. Their NVK Vulkan driver development is addressing the Vulkan performance gap directly. And the senior engineers being hired at $200,000 per year are specifically tasked with finding and eliminating the performance bottlenecks that have made NVIDIA on Linux underperform NVIDIA on Windows for the titles where the gap has been most visible. This is not NVIDIA making token gestures toward the Linux community. This is NVIDIA solving the driver problem that has been the primary technical barrier to Linux gaming becoming viable for the majority of gaming hardware. When that problem is solved, when NVIDIA on Linux performs comparably to NVIDIA on Windows across the gaming library, the last credible technical argument for Windows gaming exclusivity disappears. Not weakens. Disappears. Because the argument was never that Windows was better in some abstract sense. It was that your hardware worked better on Windows. NVIDIA is in the process of making that specific argument false. The October 2025 Windows 11 update that caused massive frame rate drops for NVIDIA GPU users playing games like Assassin's Creed Shadows and CS2 deserves specific attention because it illustrates the dynamic that is driving both NVIDIA's Linux investment and the gaming community's growing. Frustration with Windows simultaneously. Microsoft pushed an update. NVIDIA gaming performance broke, not by a marginal percentage, but by amounts that made the games unplayable at competitive settings. NVIDIA had to release an emergency hotfix to repair damage that Microsoft's own operating system update had caused. Microsoft's response time before acknowledging the problem publicly? 5 weeks. 5 weeks of gamers sitting with broken performance on hardware they paid significant money for, caused by an update they had no meaningful ability to refuse. Fixed by a workaround from the GPU manufacturer rather than accountability from the operating system developer. A company that genuinely respected its gaming user base does not take 5 weeks to acknowledge that it broke NVIDIA gaming performance for a significant portion of its installed base. That is not an oversight. That is a priority statement. And NVIDIA noticed that Microsoft's priorities increasingly do not include the gaming user experience. The broader Windows 11 state that gaming users are experiencing compounds this specific incident into a pattern. A fresh Windows 11 installation in 2026 includes Candy Crush pre-installed, Microsoft Solitaire with advertising embedded in the game itself, Clipchamp, OneDrive notifications firing constantly, Microsoft Teams installed without being requested, Copilot embedded into Notepad, File Explorer, Paint, Photos, the Start menu, and the taskbar as persistent background processes consuming between 650 and 700 megabytes of RAM. That is nearly a gigabyte of system memory dedicated to an AI assistant that the majority of users never requested. Running continuously regardless of whether the user is interacting with it, consuming resources that could be running games at higher frame rates. Windows telemetry running at a required tier that cannot be disabled, collecting hardware specifications, application usage, typing patterns, and browsing history. Required. Not optional. Not reducible below a mandatory floor regardless of user preference. For gaming users who care about frame rates and system resource allocation, an operating system consuming a gigabyte of RAM on an uninvited AI assistant before a game has launched is not a minor inconvenience. It is a measurable performance tax being extracted from hardware they paid for to fund Microsoft's AI investment narrative. The anti-cheat situation, honestly assessed, represents a real but narrowing barrier rather than a permanent wall. Kernel-level anti-cheat systems, including the one used by Valorant, block Linux at the driver level. Warzone maintains similar restrictions. For players whose gaming identity centers on these specific titles, Linux is currently not a viable primary platform. This is a genuine limitation that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. But Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye, the two most widely deployed anti-cheat systems across the majority of the gaming library, both added official Linux support years ago. The majority of online gaming titles work on Linux. The titles maintaining Linux blocks are making a business decision about whether the Linux user base is large enough to warrant the engineering investment in support and the potential changes to their security architecture. That calculation changes as the Linux user base grows. As 33% becomes 7%. As 7% becomes 10%, as NVIDIA's engineering investment closes the performance gap and removes reasons for users to stay on Windows despite their frustrations, the publisher calculation shifts. The anti-cheat barrier is a business decision responsive to market size. It is not a permanent technical wall. And every percentage point of Linux Steam market share growth changes the economics behind that business decision. Intel's behavior adds a data point that contextualizes NVIDIA's moves within a broader industry pattern. Intel is also hiring Linux GPU driver engineers. Two of the three major GPU manufacturers are investing in Linux graphics engineering simultaneously. The third, AMD, has maintained an open-source Linux driver for years and already provides exceptional Linux gaming performance. All three major GPU companies are either building Linux driver infrastructure or have been building it for years. The GPU industry, taken as a whole, has reached a conclusion about Linux's relevance to gaming that is reflected in hiring decisions, engineering investment, and driver development priorities. These are not ideological decisions. GPU companies do not make $200,000 per year engineering hires based on philosophical preferences for open-source software. They make those hires when they believe the market is moving in a direction that requires the capability. Gabe Newell publicly called Linux the next major frontier for gaming. The statement from Valve's founder deserves to be taken seriously in proportion to who is saying it. Newell has a documented track record of correctly reading where gaming markets are moving before those movements are obvious to the broader industry. He saw the shift to digital distribution before physical game retail accepted it was happening. He identified the handheld gaming market opportunity before the Steam Deck proved it. When he describes Linux as the next major frontier for gaming, it reflects the same pattern of analysis that produced those previous correct calls, informed by data, by engineering assessment, by years of watching the Steam ecosystem and understanding where the trends are pointing before they arrive in headline statistics. The Steam hardware survey showing Linux crossing 5.33% at the same moment NVIDIA is investing in Linux infrastructure, Intel is hiring Linux GPU engineers, AMD has maintained Linux driver excellence for years, Valve is expanding SteamOS beyond the Steam Deck to desktop and third-party devices, Razer appeared at CES with a Linux laptop, major OEMs are shipping Linux gaming hardware, and Windows 11 continues generating user frustration through broken updates, forced AI integration, and performance-degrading background processes. All of this is happening simultaneously. These are not disconnected events. They are a coordinated directional signal emerging from across the entire PC gaming ecosystem, each player responding independently to the same underlying market forces, but producing a convergent picture that points clearly in one direction. The Linux gaming distributions have transformed the user experience in ways that make the complexity argument that kept users on Windows through years of frustration no longer functional as a retention mechanism. Bazite, Nobara, and Pop! OS are built specifically for gaming, pre-configured with Proton, drivers, and Steam so that a working gaming setup is achievable in under 20 minutes from a fresh installation. Lutris and the Heroic Games launcher extend coverage to Epic Games Store and GOG titles beyond the Steam library. The combination of Proton's library coverage, dedicated gaming distributions that handle technical setup automatically. And NVIDIA's growing commitment to Linux driver quality has collapsed the friction gap that previously made switching a realistic option only for technically sophisticated users, willing to invest significant time in configuration. The people moving to Linux gaming today are not the Linux advocates who have been promoting the platform for 20 years. They are former Windows users who hit their personal breaking point with forced updates, broken performance, unwanted AI features, and a gigabyte of RAM consumed by Copilot, and discovered on the other side of the switch that the experience was better than they expected. Microsoft's response to all of this faces the same structural constraint that has characterized every previous Windows course correction attempt. The AI investment that is generating the Copilot features users resent, the telemetry that European governments cite as a sovereignty risk, the cloud integration that consumes background resources and redirects files, the advertising embedded in a paid operating system, all of it serves the commercial architecture that Satya Nadella rebuilt Microsoft around. Removing these elements does not address user frustration while leaving the business model intact. It requires restructuring decisions about where Microsoft generates revenue from Windows, which runs directly against the financial strategy the company has committed to publicly. Microsoft knows how to build a clean, respectful operating system. They do it for enterprise customers every day, providing configurations without advertising, with reduced telemetry, with local account options presented clearly. They made a decision that ordinary consumers do not get that same experience. That decision is a business choice, not a technical limitation. And reversing it means accepting revenue implications that Microsoft has not shown willingness to accept. The dominant position Microsoft holds in gaming is real. Windows runs on 90% of gaming PCs. The competitive multiplayer anti-cheat barrier affects specific high-profile titles. The transition requires effort that casual users will not make without strong motivation. None of this disappears because NVIDIA hired Linux engineers. But dominant positions in technology markets do not collapse from direct competition, delivering a superior product in a head-to-head comparison. They collapse from the accumulation of alternatives removing specific reasons users had for staying, combined with the incumbent making the experience of staying progressively worse. Nokia had a dominant position. BlackBerry had a dominant position. Both looked structurally unassailable until the reasons users had for staying were removed one by developments that individually seemed insufficient to threaten the incumbent but collectively undermined the entire case for the platform. Proton removed the game library argument. The Steam Deck removed the Linux gaming is fringe argument. AMD resolved the driver argument for 27% of gaming hardware. NVIDIA is in the process of resolving it for the other 73%. Bazide and Nobara removed the complexity argument. GeForce Now removed the need for a gaming operating system argument for cloud gaming. And Windows 11's ongoing decisions, the broken October update that took 5 weeks to acknowledge, the gigabyte of RAM consumed by Copilot, the Candy Crush pre-install, the advertising in File Explorer, the forced account requirements, the telemetry that cannot be disabled, are removing the argument that staying on Windows is the path of least friction. When the friction of staying exceeds the friction of switching for enough users simultaneously, the movement becomes self-sustaining. The word spreads. The community grows. The game compatibility improves with the growing user base. The hardware investment scales with the market opportunity. And the percentage climbs. NVIDIA just told you what they believe is coming. They told you with $200,000 engineering salaries, with ARM Linux gaming driver development, with GeForce Now Linux support, with Nova and NVK open source driver investment. The company that holds 73% of the gaming hardware survey is not betting its engineering resources on a platform it believes will remain marginal. Microsoft built its gaming dominance on the assumption that users had nowhere to go. NVIDIA just finished building somewhere to go for 3 out of every 4 of them.